He built the second chair before he ever placed the advertisement. And that tells you most of what you need to know about Thomas Hale. Everyone in the valley believed he was a practical man doing a practical thing, sending word east for a bride the way another man might send for seed corn or a length of fence wire, filling a gap in his life the same efficient way he filled a gap in his roof. They were wrong, though most of them would go their whole lives never knowing it, because what Thomas Hale carried into that empty farmhouse kitchen every evening was not a want for company, but a promise, spoken low and rough by a dying man who could barely lift his own hand off the quilt. Don't let this house go quiet, son. Don't let Corbett get what he's always wanted. Fill it again. Those had been Ezra Hale's last words, and a man does not forget the last words his father ever says to him, not if he is built the way Thomas was built, which is to say, sturdy, slow to speak, and incapable of leaving a debt unpaid, even one owed to the dead. The land itself sat high and wind-swept above a creek that ran cold even in August, 320 acres. His grandfather had cleared with an axe and a mule, and every fence post and every worn floorboard in that house had a story pressed into it, though Thomas rarely told those stories out loud. He kept them the way he kept his father's boots, by the door, unworn but unmoved, a shape of a man who was no longer there but had not quite been let go of either. Since Ezra's passing the rocking chair by the west window had not so much as creaked. It had belonged to Thomas's mother, dead herself these 11 years, and Ezra had never once let anyone sit in it, not even Thomas, not even when the winters were bitter and every other chair in the house was taken. "Fill it again, son," he said it looking at that chair. Thomas understood, even if he never said so to another living soul, that his father had not been asking for grandchildren or company at supper. He had been asking Thomas not to let the last of the Hales become a ghost story the neighbors told about a lonesome man on a windy ridge. There was also, and Thomas would not deny this to himself even if he denied it to everyone else, the matter of Silas Corbett. Corbett owned the bank in town and half the acreage that bordered Hale land, and Corbett had wanted the Hale Ridge since before Thomas was born, not for the grazing, which was middling at best, but for the water rights that ran under it, the deep cold spring that fed 3 counties' worth of cattle in a dry summer. Twice Corbett had offered to buy the place outright. Twice Ezra had told him, in the same flat, unbothered voice a man uses to discuss weather, that the land wasn't for sale and never would be. Corbett did not forget things like that. Men like Corbett rarely did. So, when Thomas placed his advertisement in a paper 3 states over, seeking a wife of sound character and sober habits, willing to keep a working homestead, he told himself it was for the promise, and it was for the promise. But somewhere underneath that, quiet as a held breath, it was also a wall he was building, against a man who had been circling his family's gate for 30 years. A quick word to the viewers watching this unfold with me tonight, before the story carries us further up that ridge road. Stay with it to the end, because what arrived on the afternoon stage was not at all what Thomas Hale or Silas Corbett or anyone in that valley was prepared for. She came in on the 3 o'clock stage with a single trunk, a gray traveling coat gone soft at the elbows from wear rather than neglect, and an expression that gave away exactly nothing, which was the first thing Thomas noticed about her, standing there on the dusty platform with his hat in his hands like a boy called up in front of the schoolmaster. He had expected, if he had allowed himself to expect anything at all, someone timid, someone worn thin by hardship and hungry for rescue. What he got instead was a woman who looked him over the way a buyer looks over a horse, before a sale, unhurried, unembarrassed, taking her time. "You're Thomas Hale," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am," he answered, and immediately felt foolish for the ma'am, since she couldn't have been more than a few years younger than himself. "My name is Nora," she said, and offered her hand for shaking rather than for kissing, which surprised him more than it should have. Nora vain. He shook it. Her grip was firm, dry, a working hand, despite the fine stitching on her cuffs. He loaded her trunk onto the wagon himself, refusing her offer to help, and she let him, watching with the patient, evaluating look of someone cataloging what kind of man she'd traveled 400 miles to marry. The ride out to the ridge took the better part of an hour, and for most of it neither of them spoke, which suited Thomas fine since he had never in his life found silence uncomfortable, only what people insisted on filling it with. It was Nora who finally broke it, not with small talk, but with a question that told him more about her than an hour of pleasantries would have. "Is the land in your name alone?" she asked. "Or is there a bank holding paper on it?" He glanced at her sideways. "Mine alone," he said. "Free and clear since my grandfather's day." She nodded, satisfied, and said nothing further, but Thomas noted the question and filed it away the way he filed away everything, quietly, without comment, the way a man notes a crack in a beam that isn't dangerous yet, but bears watching. When they crested the last rise and the house came into view, gray-shingled and squat against the darkening sky, she studied it for a long moment before saying, "It needs a coat of paint before winter." "It does," he agreed, surprised into something close to a smile. Everyone he'd ever brought up that road had commented on the view first. She had gone straight to the house's needs as if she meant to stay long enough to see them met. That evening he showed her to the room that had been his mother's sewing room, now cleared and fitted with a narrow bed, and she set her single trunk at its foot without comment on its smallness or its plainness, only asking where the well was and where the stove wood was kept and what time he took his breakfast. Practical questions. He answered them plainly, and she nodded at each answer, like a woman committing figures to a ledger. It was 3 days before he saw her hesitate at anything, and even then it was small, easy to miss, unless a man was paying the kind of close attention Thomas Hale had always paid to things that mattered to him. A letter came up with the mail rider, addressed to Nora Vane in a hand Thomas didn't recognize, and she took it from him without a word, but her fingers went white at the knuckle where they gripped the envelope, and she did not open it in front of him, tucking it instead into the pocket of her apron as though it weighed considerably more than paper ought to. Later that night, walking past her door, he heard the low crackle of something burning in the small stove in her room, though the evening was mild enough not to need a fire. He said nothing. It was not his business, he told himself, though the telling did not entirely convince him. The weeks that followed built themselves the way a good wall builds itself, one plain stone laid carefully atop another, no single stone remarkable, the whole of it slowly becoming something sturdy enough to lean on. Nora rose before he did, which surprised him the first morning, and simply became fact by the fourth, and she kept the books for the homestead with a precision that put his own scratched ledger to shame, catching a miscounted head of cattle in the spring tally that had thrown his figures off for 2 years running. She did not fuss over the house the way he'd half expected a new bride to fuss, hanging curtains and rearranging what didn't need rearranging. Instead, she fixed what was broken and left what wasn't, mending the hinge on the pantry door before it even noticed it, sagged, patching a hole in the porch screen with a scrap of wire mesh she'd found in the barn without being asked. Gus Pratt, who ran the spread 2 miles south and had known Thomas since before Thomas could walk a straight furrow, rode up one afternoon under the excuse of borrowing a plow blade, and stayed long enough to watch Nora split kindling with 3 clean strokes of the hatchet, stacking it neat as a woodcutter, twice her size. "Well," Gus said afterward, leaning on the fence with the particular squint he used when he had something dry to say, "you sent off for a bride, and the county sent you back a hired hand who happens to cook." Thomas didn't answer that, but he didn't argue it either. Evenings, they ate at the same table where his father and mother had eaten. And though conversation between them stayed spare, it was not uncomfortable, more like the quiet of 2 people who had already agreed. There was no need to fill every silence with noise. She asked him once, over stew, whether he missed his father, and when he said he did, she said, "My father and I did not have that kind of missing between us," and left it there, and Thomas, sensing the door she'd cracked open and then quietly shut again, did not push it further, though he noted it, the way he noted everything. There was a gentleness that grew between them without either of them naming it romance, built instead on small competencies witnessed and quietly admired. She noticed he favored his left shoulder after a full day of fence work and began, without comment, setting a jar of liniment by his wash basin each evening. He noticed she flinched at the sound of a rider approaching fast and began, without comment, making sure she could see the road from wherever she stood in the house. Neither of them spoke of these small accommodations. They simply happened, the way water finds its level. One evening in early autumn, with a storm building blue and heavy over the western ridge, they worked together to get the last of the hay under cover before the rain broke, and when the first drops finally came, driving hard and cold, they stood beneath the barn overhang, laughing, actually laughing, at how thoroughly soaked they'd both gotten anyway despite the mad dash, and it was the first time Thomas had heard her laugh without restraint, a sound that surprised her as much as it did him, judging by the way she pressed her hand briefly to her own mouth afterward, as though she'd let something slip that she hadn't meant to. "That was a good sound," he said, before he could stop himself. She looked at him a long moment, rain dripping from her lashes, and said only, "It's been a while since I had reason to make it." And something in the way she said it, some weight underneath the plain words, told him there was a great deal more behind that sentence than she intended to share. He let it be. He was learning, slowly, that with Nora Vane the things left unsaid were often heavier than the things spoken, and that a man who wanted to know her fully was going to have to earn each piece she offered, one careful stone at a time. It was the letters that first told Thomas something was being kept from him, though he was slow, being an honest man himself, to suspect dishonesty in anyone he'd grown to trust. They came perhaps twice a month, always in that same unfamiliar hand, and always Nora's manner would shift slightly for a day or two afterward, a certain tightness around her eyes, a habit of glancing toward the road more often than usual. When he asked, gently, who was writing to her so regular, she said, "An old acquaintance from home, checking that I've settled well," and the answer was smooth enough that a less attentive man might have let it lie. But Thomas had spent his whole life reading weather in the sky and sickness in cattle before either fully showed itself, and he recognized the particular stillness of someone choosing their words with more care than the question required. Around the same time, talk began to move through town the way talk does, quiet at first and then less quiet. That Silas Corbett's bank had called in several notes early that autumn, notes that had sat comfortably for years on smaller places up and down the valley, and that Corbett himself had been seen out riding the boundary line between his acreage and the Hale Ridge more than once, slow and unhurried. The way a man rides land he expects to own soon. Gus brought this news up to the house himself, sitting his horse at the gate rather than dismounting, which was how Thomas knew he considered it serious. "Corbett's been asking after your note," Gus said. "The one your daddy took out for the well repair back before you were married. Might be nothing, might not. Might not." Thomas had forgotten, in the slow business of running a place and building a marriage, that his father had ever taken a note against the land at all, a small sum, paid down steadily over years, nearly cleared. He said as much to Gus. Gus only shrugged, the way a man shrugs when he suspects more than he's willing to say outright, and rode off toward home. That night at supper, Thomas mentioned Corbett's name, plain and unremarkable, simply passing along the gossip of the day the way neighbors do. He watched Nora's face when he said it. He watched her hand, still over her fork. He watched the color drain, quick and complete, from a face that had, in 3 months of marriage, never once given him cause to doubt its honesty. "You know him," Thomas said. It wasn't a question either, this time, any more than her first question to him had been. Nora set down her fork with great care, as though the table itself might shatter if she moved too fast, and said, "I need to tell you something, and I should have told you the day I arrived." And then, because the moment demanded it, and because some truths cannot be delayed a single hour longer once they've been named, she told him her name was not entirely a lie, only half of one. Vane had been her mother's maiden name, taken up like a borrowed coat the day she boarded the eastbound train with nothing but a single trunk and the determination never to be found. Her father's name, the name she had spent her whole life under until 3 months prior, was Corbett. Silas Corbett's only daughter, raised in the cold comfort of his money and the colder comfort of his ambition, had fled a house where affection was measured out like rationed grain and where she had watched her father, for as long as she could remember, circle the Hale land the way a hawk circles a rabbit too stubborn to run. She had answered Thomas's advertisement, not out of desperation exactly, but out of a hunger to be somewhere. Her name meant nothing, to be judged for her hands and her sense rather than her father's fortune. And she had told herself, in the weeks it took the letter to travel and the answer to come back. That leaving the name behind was leaving the man behind too. It hadn't worked. The letters, she confessed, had come from a clerk in her father's employ, a man loyal enough to her personally, if not to her cause, to keep her informed of what Silas Corbett was doing, because she had feared, correctly as it turned out, that her father's reach was long enough to follow her even here. And the note, she said, her voice steady now in the flat, careful way of someone finally setting down a weight they'd carried too long, the note your father took, the one nearly paid off. My father bought it up from the original lender years ago, quietly, through a third party. And he's been sitting on it ever since, waiting. He means to call the balance due all at once, and he means to do it before the year turns, because he knows your father is gone. And he believes a man alone or a man newly married with a stranger's name on his table will not have the funds gathered fast enough to stop him. Thomas sat very still. The storm that had been building outside all evening finally broke over the ridge, rain drumming hard against the window pane, and for a long moment, the only sound in that kitchen was the rain and the low complaint of the old stove settling. "You knew this," he said finally, "and did not tell me." "I was afraid," she said, and did not flinch from the word the way he half expected her to. "Afraid you'd send me back the moment you knew whose blood I carried. Afraid it would matter more than anything else. I'd shown you these 3 months, and I was wrong to wait. I know that now. But I am telling you, tonight, all of it, because I would rather you hate me for the truth than love me for a lie one day longer." He did not say anything for a long while, and Thomas Hale's silences had never before felt to Nora the way this one felt, heavy and uncertain, a hell breath she could not guess the shape of. She had expected anger, and she could have borne anger, having grown up fluent in her father's temper and skilled at weathering it. What she had not prepared herself for was the particular quality of hurt that moved slowly across Thomas's face, not fury, but something closer to grief, the look of a man discovering a crack in a beam he'd trusted his whole roof to. "You let me tell you about my father dying," he said at last, his voice low and even, the way it got when he was working hardest to keep it from breaking. "You let me talk about the promise. You sat there and heard all of it, and never once said whose daughter you were." "I should have," Nora said. "I know that. But I'll tell you the truth of why I didn't, if you're willing to hear it plain, because I think you're a man who deserves plain even when it costs something." "Say it," he said. "I didn't tell you because for the first time in my whole life, someone was building something with me instead of around me," she said. "My father never once asked what I thought a fence line should look like, or whether the hay was in before the rain, or whether I was tired after a long day. You did, without even meaning it as kindness, simply because that's how you are with people who share your work. And I was afraid the moment you knew my name, you'd stop seeing me and start seeing him. That's the truth. It isn't a good enough reason. I know that too." Thomas rose from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-dark yard where his father's rocking chair sat empty in its place by the glass, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. And Nora sat with her hands folded tight in her lap, and let him have the silence because she understood that some men need a great deal of quiet before they can speak a true thing. When he finally turned back to her, his face had settled into something steadier, though the hurt hadn't left it, only moved to the side to make room for thought. "Will, my father spent 30 years waiting for Corbett to come collect on a debt that was never really about money," he said. "It was about pride, and about a piece of land Corbett couldn't stand not owning. I don't know yet what I feel about you being his blood. I won't lie to you and say it doesn't sit strange in my chest tonight, but I know this much. You've spent 3 months proving to me, in 100 small ways, exactly what kind of person you are, and none of those 100 small ways were lies. The letters were a secret. You yourself were not. There's a difference, and I mean to hold on to that difference while I sit with the rest of it." Nora felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't realized was clenched tight since the day she boarded that eastbound train. "What do you mean to do?" she asked. "About the note." Thomas was quiet a moment longer. "I mean to go see your father he said finally. "Before the year turns, and before he thinks he's caught me unprepared. And I want you beside me when I do it, if you're willing. Because I think there's something you know about that man's business dealings that could matter more than any argument I could make on my own." Nora studied him, searching his face for the anger she still half expected to find hiding somewhere beneath the calm, and found instead only steadiness, only the same patient, weathered resolve she'd watched him bring to every broken fence post and every stubborn calf these 3 months past. "I'm willing," she said. "More than willing." And so, with the storm still rattling the windows and the rocking chair sitting silent in its corner, they began, together, to plan how a rancher and a runaway daughter might stand against a man who believed money could buy back anything, including a life. They rode into town 3 days later, the morning cold and clear in the way autumn mornings get right before winter finally commits to itself, and Silas Corbett received them in the back office of his bank with the unhurried courtesy of a man who believes he has already won whatever contest is about to unfold. He was leaner than Thomas expected, gray at the temples, with the particular stillness of men who have learned that patience, more than force, is what finally brings other men to their knees. "Nora," he said when they entered, and something moved behind his eyes at the sight of her, though whether it was affection or simple calculation, Thomas could not tell, and suspected Nora herself could not entirely tell either. "I wondered how long it would take you to come home, one way or another." "I haven't come home," Nora said, her voice steady as a level beam. "I've come to see you honor a debt of your own, before you go collecting on someone else's." Corbett's smile thinned. He gestured. For them to sit, they did not. Thomas laid a single folded paper on the desk between them, the note his father had taken out years ago nearly paid to nothing, and beside it he laid a second paper, one Nora had spent the last 3 days helping him assemble from her own memory of her father's business, and from the careful, quiet correspondence of the clerk who had once written her those letters, a document detailing the exact terms under which Corbett had purchased the note from its original lender, terms that included, buried in language meant to discourage close reading, a clause forbidding early call of the balance for a full decade from the date of purchase, a clause Silas Corbett had clearly been counting on nobody remembering to check. "You bought this note 8 years ago," Thomas said, plain and unhurried, the way he'd say the weather was turning. "That means you've got 2 years left before you can call it early, by your own signed terms. I imagine the bank examiners in the capital would find that an interesting detail, if it ever came to their attention that you'd tried calling it 4 seasons ahead of schedule against a widower's son." Silence settled over that back office, heavy and complete. And for the first time since Thomas had entered, Silas Corbett's composure showed a hairline crack. He looked at his daughter for a long moment, something almost like respect flickering across features, otherwise carved from long practice at showing nothing at all. "You'd ruin your own father's name to protect a piece of dirt," he said. "I'd protect a man who never once asked me to be anyone but myself," Nora answered, and the way she said it, quiet and absolutely certain, told Thomas everything he still needed to know about where her heart had finally settled, if he'd harbored any lingering doubt at all. Corbett did not apologize. Men like him rarely do. But he took back the early call, muttering something about clerical error that satisfied no one in that room, least of all himself. And Thomas and Nora rode home together as the winter's first real cold settled over the ridge, saying little because there was little left that needed saying out loud just then. The plain fact of what they'd done together standing sturdy enough between them, without decoration. Winter came hard that year, the way it does in high country, but the house on the ridge held warm against it, woodpile stacked deep, the well running clear and cold beneath ground that would never now belong to any name but Hale. Thomas painted the house that first spring just as Nora had said it needed, and she stood in the yard directing him on the color with the same unhurried authority she brought to every practical matter, and Gus rode up to watch and pronounced it the finest-looking place on the ridge. Though he couldn't resist adding that he still thought the county had sent Thomas a hired hand instead of a wife, and Nora, without missing a beat, told him the county had sent exactly what the house had ordered, and Gus laughed loud enough to startle the horses. The letters stopped coming after that winter, the clerk's usefulness spent, and in their place came other correspondence, ordinary and unremarkable, seed catalogs and neighborly notes, the kind of mail that builds a life rather than threatens one. And on the evening of their first anniversary, with snow just beginning to dust the window glass, Thomas came in from the barn to find Nora sitting, for the very first time, in his mother's old rocking chair by the west window, mending a shirt by lamplight, entirely unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, of what that chair had meant, standing empty all those years. He stood in the doorway a long moment watching her. The promise his father had spoken finally settled into something living and warm rather than a debt owed to the dead, and when she looked up and caught him watching, she only said, "This chair rocks smoother than I expected." And Thomas Hale, a man not given to declarations, crossed the room, knelt by the chair and said the truest thing he knew how to say. "You filled it," he told her. Just like he asked. And outside, the snow kept falling soft and steady over land that was at long last entirely and only theirs.